We're calling the series Wrestling with Jacob, the Divine Dilemma. I'll be introducing the topic for about 10 minutes, then Brad will follow me, and Archbishop Lazar will follow Brad, and Wayne Northey will follow Archbishop Lazar. The Bible holds a very significant place in Western civilization and certainly the globe. Much more than, for example, Homer or Hesiod or Virgil, or with Indian thought, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, or Beowulf. In Anglo-Saxon thought, it tends to be seen as a foundation document for the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, and it has certainly impacted the Islamic heritage, and you'll find significant elements of it in the Quran. Now, given the fact the Bible is so foundational, it raises very interesting questions about God and the relationship of God to people. And so we're naming this Wrestling with Jacob. Jacob wrestled with God all night. God honored that honest wrestling in the night, and often our deepest wrestlings are in the darkness when there often doesn't seem a lot of light. And so Jacob's wrestling was honored by God, and he limped as a result of it. And often those who wrestle in the night, there is a limp in the soul. But we'll do what we can in this wrestling with Jacob and see where we go. I'm going to touch on three elements of this within the Bible, the divine dilemma as a part of the wrestling. And these are some of the, as it were, seed areas from which plants grow from the seed. The first is the issue of the sovereignty of God. And the question over the sovereignty of God within the Hebrew canon is God pure will? Is God I am who I am? Does God have a nature, or can God do as God wills? And no one can tell God what to do. Linked into sovereignty within the Jewish tradition is the notion of God has chosen to elect certain people, and these people are the apple of his eye. And as a result of that, you get the notion that certain people are more special and other people play a secondary role. Now, within the Jewish tradition, what you have in this, back of this notion of sovereignty, is that an ethnic nationalism emerges from this, in which the Jews are always chosen by God, and regardless of what the Jews do, they will always remain central to who God is, even though there will be constant reforming within them when they violate the divine commands, the expectations of God. But if you start with the notion of sovereignty and election, you also get with the Jews, God chooses them and gives them land. Obviously, other people were on this land when God chose them. And God, in his sovereignty, by electing the Jews, tells the Jews on the one hand that there are these commandments, they're not to murder, they're not to steal. On the other hand, you get God telling the Jews they're to go into this land and wipe out people. And so you get this violent God who is sovereign, who is to be obeyed, and if you disobey him, there's serious consequences for doing so. And yet the very obedience itself violates the very Decalogue or 10 Commandments that the Jewish people eventually are given. And so there's this real conundrum within the nature of God and how God's revelation appeals to the Jewish people and what they're commanded to do. This is the one hand of the sovereignty that God commands, you're expected to do. If you disobey, there's serious consequences for the people. And this is where you get so much of the violence, certainly in the Old Testament. So there's this ethnic nationalism on the one hand, which is one side of the dilemma. The other side is this very high ethical standard. So you get an ethnic nationalism, and on the other hand, you get a prophetic nationalism, which comes from God, in which the prophets are not only to speak to the Jewish people, but God is one who is good. God transcends ethnic nationalism, and he loves the foreigner, loves the outcast, merciful, just, long-suffering. In the book of Jonah, for example, which is quite a contrast to the book of Deuteronomy, which can be seen as the first political manifesto in the West, you get God loving the Assyrians and not wanting to destroy the children, the animals. Quite a difference to Deuteronomy, where you're to wipe out people, children, and animals. And so within the Jewish tradition, the first dilemma is sovereignty, will, chosenness, and how that can lead to violence, genocide, imperialism. And on the other hand, this very, very high, what we would call prophetic nationalism, in which the Jews are to be a light to the people. The second one, which was an anthropological issue, largely within the Protestant tradition and significant elements of the Roman Catholic tradition, less so in the Orthodox tradition. There is the notion of total depravity, original sin. Most of us would probably in the West know the well-known hymn, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. So there's this notion of what it means to be human is totally depraved, the first letter of the Tulip from the Calvinist, one of the Calvinist confessions. There is no good in people either in thought or will, and this leads to a certain understanding of what it means to be human, rather than a more complex understanding, and that we are combined within us, sort of as it were, light and darkness, good, mediocrity, and evil. And so if you start from an anthropological position which is decidedly negative about humans, this has a certain notion and implications for human identity and a whole range of issues. This has not always been the Christian position, but it has significant impact on Western theology, so very negative anthropology. The last one I want to touch on, which is a part of this, and there's a whole reread going on now in the New Testament, is when we read Paul in Romans and Galatians, there's often this juxtaposition between grace and law. Law is seen as that which is oppressive. It is the very thing that brings a person to their knees calling out for grace. And so if law is seen in purely a negative way, and this is what you get in Paul's writings, and grace liberates us from this, we can see very easily where the penal theory of the atonement comes in, and the juridical theory of the atonement is a child of this grace-law dilemma, in which nobody can fulfill the law. We are tried before God, before God's holiness. We are convicted, and only in Christ's sacrificial death are we seen through Christ as good before God. But what if this read of Paul is problematic? And I grew up when certainly my first Sunday school teacher was Terence Donaldson. He's gone on to become the Lord and Lady Coggan Professor of New Testament Studies at Wycliffe, very much drawing on the insights of E.P. Sanders when I did my PhD studies at McMaster, James Dunn, N.T. Wright. These people are all rethinking Paul's understanding of grace law. When I did my PhD, it was Martin Buber and Abraham Heschel and all of these people. They're saying, why is the law seen as negative and grace good? Cannot the law itself be a means of grace? And is it not just a pointer on the trail for which God's mercy is always there when we stumble off the trail? So these 3 points I just want to briefly touch on in terms of a wrestling with Jacob. One, the sovereignty of God. What do we mean by it? Can God say, I am who I am, and do as he or she wills, including violence, sending people genocide? Or is God good? And if so, that contains very much the commands of God when they violate certain ethical standards. 2, the anthropology. Do we need a more nuanced and subtle understanding of what it means to be human, other than total depravity, original sin? And I think obviously we do. And then 3rd, that grace law in which Luther, Calvin, a certain read of Augustine is applied, is highly problematic and being rethought today by scholars in New Testament and Old Testament studies. And so wrestling with Jacob, the Old Testament New is a very complex book, very dangerous to read it devotionally. We have to read it wisely, judiciously, and discerningly. And from this point, I will stop and move on to Brad and the important work that he is doing in the more Christ-like God.